What if a school could be there for all of you? Career, family, finances, and mental health. Well, it can. National University, supporting the whole you. Learn more at nu.edu.
Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to go back to an episode we did a few weeks ago on the lost colony of Roanoke. If you haven't listened to that episode, I do encourage you to go back and listen to it. This episode's going to sort of focus in on one of the personalities of the lost colony drama, and that is Sir Walter Raleigh. And Chris, when we think of Sir Walter Raleigh, you think of someone who, Raleigh, North Carolina is named after. You think about someone that, a lot of people may know something about, but this is a man who has a very fascinating life with many different phases to his life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the way that you said it, talking about that he was a personality, because, if you study the life and times of Sir Walter Raleigh, there are times that make you chuckle. There are times that make you go, oh, my gracious. And then there are times in which he can seem to be a hero and other times where he's a villain. And all of this is wrapped up into this one guy who not only has great success in the way that he kind of broaches his own desires, but also through the way that he is known as a scholar, as a poet, as a member of government, as maybe a friend to the Queen in very intimate terms, and then also for helping the world know a lot about different things through his writings and through his just overall engagement with anything and everything. If he could get his hands on it, he did. And I think that it was to assert the idea that he wanted gold, he wanted glory, and he wanted power, not just necessarily for England or for the Queen, but ultimately for himself.
Yeah, and he lived at a time when the world was changing. You think about the mid to late 16th century and the all what was going on in the New World and all that was going on throughout Europe. It was a really changing world, and he found himself smack dab in the middle of the military and political situations that were going on. So we think about Walter Raleigh. Of course, he is born around 1554. Exact birthday is sort of unknown. He is the youngest of 5 sons. He's born to Catherine and Walter Raleigh. So I guess that would make him a junior, Sir Walter Raleigh Jr. And both of those people were, of course, in their second marriage at the time he's born. So he has a whole bunch of siblings, a good number of siblings. And of course, when you think about someone who sort of enters the inner workings of government and all that, in this day and time when Walter Raleigh was living, you sort of had to be born into it. There was very little social mobility going on, and he certainly was. His family was well connected with Queen Elizabeth I. His half brother Humphrey Gilbert, of course, was an explorer and also a member of Parliament. And he also had another brother called Carew Raleigh, who is also a very influential person there in the government of England. And he's going to grow up, Chris. He's going to grow up a devout Protestant. And then, of course, Mary the First of England, famously known as Bloody Mary, is going to come to the throne and try to reassert the Catholic Church there in England. And, is going to launch a persecution on Protestants throughout England. And that is going to create within Walter Raleigh a deep, deep hatred for Catholicism. And, so these are his early years.
Yeah, and I think it's always interesting when if you're from North Carolina and you're aware, of course, the capital being Raleigh, but yet there's also the place known as Hayes Barton. There's a church there called Hayes Barton Baptist Church, and actually Raleigh was born at Hayes Barton in Devon, England. So it's just always cool to go back and recognize where we get some of these names for in these respective cities. So, basically, he goes to school. He does receive some education at Oxford, but he never really receives a degree. But while he's there, people start to see that here is this ambitious, very charismatic young man who is wanting to really make a difference in the world. And what we start finding is he develops a really strong relationship to his half brother that you just mentioned, Sir Humphrey Gilbert. And Humphrey Gilbert was fearless and sometimes a reckless character. And his stepbrother, Humphrey, had been rewarded for his scorched earth treatment of Irish rebels. And so here comes Sir Walter Raleigh, looking to make a name for himself, looking for an opportunity to find a way that he can get into the good graces of the Queen and other people. And he was encouraged to go over to Ireland and to participate in a few rebellions, if you will. And when we talk about this, we're going to have to keep something in mind, that here is Sir Walter Raleigh, whose capital of North Carolina is named after him. So we have to look at the good, the bad, and the ugly of this guy. And one of the ugly points of his life is in November 1580, when he goes over to Ireland and he is deliberate about attacking a group of Catholic individuals in Ireland. And even though the Catholics will surrender, even though the troops will say, we don't want to fight you, Raleigh has the women, the Catholic women, hanged. He has the priest gruesomely executed. He puts the soldiers to the sword. And all of this is being done after these individuals had willingly laid down their arms for surrender purposes. And yet I think Raleigh saw this as an opportunity that he could make the Queen proud. He could really just kind of get in close to her. And so by doing this, he really sets aside a bad name for himself, but into the Queen's eye, he becomes absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, and his activity there in Ireland does catch Queen Elizabeth's eye, and she actually invites him into her court. That is, sort of into her inner circle, where he's going to, I guess you could say, butter up to the Queen a little bit. He is definitely a man on a mission. He's not just simply happy just being in the court. He wants to be as close to Elizabeth as he can be. And there is a story, and it may be a bit apocryphal, but there's a story where Queen Elizabeth was walking one day, and I guess she came up to a mud puddle, and he took his cloak off and threw it down on the ground so that she could walk across this puddle without getting her royal feet wet. And he goes so far as to refer to her as the goddess Cynthia, who had the power over water and power over tide. So he knows how to get her attention. He knows how to put himself in the best light as far as she's concerned, and he's working really hard to get even closer to the Queen.
Yeah, it's said that he was 6'2". He was well built. He was extremely handsome, and he was a charmer. He knew what to do, and he's a poet. And he starts writing this poetry, and he called them his famous Cynthia poems. And the Queen develops a nickname for Raleigh. The nickname she gives him is Water. And so that kind of goes along with your story that you were talking about there, because, as he's talking about, well, the Queen is like the goddess Cynthia, and she reminds me of the goddess of the moon, who has complete power over the tide or even water. And so he uses that as a way just to be a devoted servant, to find himself in the good graces. I thought it was very interesting that one of his most famous portraits, if you go and look at him, he is wearing the colors of the queen, which was black and white. That was her favorite colors. He is wearing in his ear a pearl, which was like her emblem that she always had. And if you look in the background of that picture, there is this crescent moon, which kind of paints it again that, you know, she is in the background guiding him and leading him. She is the goddess of the water, as she liked to call him. And he is ambitious. We have to ask ourselves, okay, so what's his end game here? Is his end game like, oh my gosh, I'm interested in having a relationship with the queen that is intimate, or am I interested in trying to find a way that I can become better and receive more and get the power, the gold, and the glory that I so want if I charm my way to the inner recesses of the queen's chamber? And very quickly, we find out that it's probably the latter, because he makes one of the biggest mistakes that he ever could have made with the queen.
Going back to, and this sort of bridges to this big mistake you're talking about that he makes with her, going back to the possibility of a romantic relationship between Walter Raleigh and Queen Elizabeth. Of course, Queen Elizabeth is known as the Virgin King. The state of Virginia, or originally the colony of Virginia, was named after her. And of course, there has been for many years speculation as to whether or not there was anything going on between the two of them more than just simply friendship. No, I do agree with you, Chris. It's whatever their relationship really was. As far as Walter Raleigh was concerned, I think he was just an ambitious man who was willing to do whatever it took to get into power. And, you know, Elizabeth I was very generous with Walter Raleigh. She very much liked Walter Raleigh. She sought to protect Walter Raleigh, even going so far sometimes as to forbid him to travel overseas. She, of course, has him knighted as Sir Walter Raleigh in 1584. But then in her eyes, Chris, he betrays her. And this is what lends me to think that maybe, at least in her mind, maybe there was more going on than just simply a political relationship.
Yeah, it's common knowledge that she was a looker, that she was always interested in bringing in the best looking and the most handsome of men to kind of work in her inner circles. And she had given this guy the keys to the kingdom, just about. I mean, she gave him houses, castles, knighting, and put him in charge of so many things. At one time, he was even put in charge of her bodyguard services. And all of these things were going on. And while that's happening, she's also managing the affairs of the government. And she has people that are working for her, these hand servants, these maids, these courtiers, other people that are involved. And one of them that was working for her was a lady that was named Elizabeth Best Throckmorton. She was a royal attendant. And part of the deal about being a royal attendant is not only do you get to personally care for the queen, but you are basically a servant which has to do the bidding of the queen. In other words, you really can't even eat without the queen telling you you can eat. You can't do anything without the queen's permission, and that included marriage. And the queen was insistent that anybody that works underneath her was forbidden to marry unless they had first gone to the queen and asked for permission. And so lo and behold, one day, the queen finds out that her servant, Bess Throckmorton, has not only married, but is now pregnant. And the baby's daddy is Sir Walter Raleigh, the one that she has given everything to. And so the queen is furious because she feels betrayed by Sir Walter Raleigh, whether or not there was anything going on. She felt betrayed because he knew you didn't mess with the servants. And the servant knew You didn't marry without the queen's permission. And so she gets so mad that she takes Bess and she takes Raleigh and throws them both in the Tower of London, which is kind of going to be the first of three visits to the Tower of London for old Raleigh there. And so while they are there, the baby gets sick with the plague and will die. And, eventually the queen kind of relents and says, okay, I'm going to let the mom get out a little bit early. I'm going to keep him in there because I want him to know how wrong he's been. And then eventually he'll be let out. But Ray, the relationship between the queen and Sir Walter Raleigh will never be the same as it was. They'll still have a relationship. She will still use him. He will still use her. But the reality is it will never be the closeness and the intimacy that it once was.
After he is released from the Tower of London, he's banished from her court. So he's removed from the inner circle. And I think I wanted to go back a little bit about the marriage between Walter Raleigh and Bess. Why did they feel the need to have a secret wedding? They could have gone through formal channels and gotten her blessing on their union, but they didn't. And I know this is speculation on my part, but it sort of lends, at least in my mind, credence to this idea that at least from Elizabeth's point of view, there was more between her and Walter Raleigh than politics and being a member of her court. So I think she was personally hurt when she found out that Walter and Bess had gone off and gotten married and had were about to have a child. But she, of course, eventually releases both of them from the Tower of London, and Walter Raleigh goes right back to his many adventures in an attempt to get back into the Queen's circle. So he goes off to Guinea in South America in search of El Dorado, this sort of mythical golden land that he's sort of searching for. Of course, he does not find it, but he does get back into her court in 1597. He is able to get back into her court and back into her good graces. But it, like you said, it doesn't last for long.
Yeah, and I mean, she brings him back, but she really doesn't show that she's impressed with anything that he's been doing, because the reality is every time he goes on an adventure, every time he basically does something, he finds a way to screw it up. Somehow, some way. I mean, you can go back to our previous episode and we can talk about what happened with the Lost Colony and, the results of that terrible thing that took place. You can look at El Dorado, you can see his pursuits in Ireland. And so, basically, he's just all over the place, just so focused and consumed on gold, glory, and power that I think he just loses purpose and ways to work with people and how to survive. And what basically happens is James of Scotland will become James I of England as he succeeds Elizabeth I. And I think that Raleigh might have thought he was going to say, okay, I kind of messed up with the queen, but now I got a new king in town and, I'll just kind of come in and maybe we can just let bygones be bygones and I can start all over and maybe everything's going to be okay. But very quickly, Raleigh realizes that the king is not interested in Raleigh's charm whatsoever, as Elizabeth had once been. And the thing with James is really intent on improving relations with Spain, which is Catholic. And Raleigh, as we've already identified, has been raised all of his life to hate Catholics. And he has sent individuals over to the New World, to the Lost Colony, to oppose Spanish expansion. And so there, all of a sudden, it's going to be a conflict when you have James I, who's trying to mend fences, if you will, with Spain, and you have Raleigh, who is spewing this animosity towards Catholics and towards Spaniards and to anybody else. And Raleigh being a show-off, if you will, using his pride, his extravagance, his bold talk, doesn't help. And pretty soon, everybody's talking about what a problem Raleigh is in the king's court. And it's going to eventually cause the king to say, okay, I've had enough of you. We've got to do something.
You know, his efforts to romance, so to speak, James I did not work. And his bigotry against the Spanish and against Spaniards certainly was going to come back and haunt him later on. But then he does get involved in something called the Main Plot, which was a plot to overthrow King James I. You know, I don't think, Chris, we have to tell our listeners that monarchs in the 16th century and in the early 17th century, these were people who viewed themselves not just simply as governors, not just simply as rulers, but as people who had the divine right of kings, people who viewed themselves as God's person. They are God's man, or in the case of Elizabeth or Mary, God's woman. So in July of 1603, there's an effort to remove King James the throne and replace King James with his cousin, Lady Arabella Stuart. And there were a series of people who were involved in this plot. And when it is uncovered, Walter Raleigh is sort of gotten mixed up in this plot to overthrow King James I. So Raleigh is sent right back to the Tower of London by King James I. Of course, this being his second visit, as you said, to the Tower of London.
Yeah, and this is something, you know, when we think about just history, but also today, this is where gossip destroys people. And we see this with Raleigh, because I really think that all, you know, basically the allegation comes from one guy, right? And this one guy is making up this story, and he's saying, oh yeah, here's the deal. We're going to work out this deal to bring Lady Arabella in. She's going to take over, and, you know, and we're going to overthrow the king. But think about what we just talked about. Raleigh couldn't stand Spain.
Right.
Raleigh couldn't stand the Catholics. What would Raleigh want to go into a deal with the enemy, that the people that he hates the most, just so that he can undermine James I, for which he really at this point has no reason to have conflict with? And so I just wonder, you know, everybody's talking all of this about Raleigh. He is, you know, bold and brash. And I think people might have just been fed up with him. And maybe James saying, okay, it might look good if I take someone and make an example out of. Who can I take? Oh, I'll take the person that has repeatedly and voicefully said, I can't stand Spain. I can't stand Catholics. I'm going to take that guy and I'm going to lock him up and I am going to kill him. And that maybe that will bridge the relationship between England and Spain. So maybe Raleigh was a pawn in this whole global peace agreement that they were trying to work out, because Raleigh couldn't keep his mouth shut and because some other guy sat there and just gossiped against him.
Yeah, you know, kings back in this time were not one to worry about evidence too much. You know, if it was even rumored that you were involved in a plot to overthrow the king, you could find yourself in a prison or much worse. And Walter Raleigh goes to prison and he expects to die. I mean, he writes a letter basically encouraging Bess as to how to move forward with her life. And so he expects fully not to get out of the Tower of London alive. He expects that he's going to be executed. James I, however, seems to have a moment of mercy for James, in that he basically says, we're not going to execute him, but he's going to stay there for the rest of his life.
Yeah, and it's I think it's interesting, and not to belabor this point about James or Raleigh's stay in the Tower of London, but you know, really the stay at the Tower of London wasn't that bad.
No.
for Raleigh during this time. The Tower of London had a library, and there was like 500 books in that library. And he started working on this book called The History of the World. He actually was really good friends with James I's son, I think Prince Henry, and was really good with trying to educate him and trying to help him. And one of the things while he was in prison, he would take these seeds that he would get from places that he had traveled or that his half brother had traveled. And, he would make these concoctions and these herbal medicines. And Ray, I thought one that was really interesting, he used this balsam from Guyana, which was like this strawberry water. And he had this mixture of like 40 ingredients that included herbs, spices. He had powders of pearl. He had deer's horn. And Ray, he had this thing that was called ambergris, which is he would get the secretion from a sperm whale's intestines, and he would put it all together, and he thought that it could heal you, and it would be so good. And I just have to imagine, even Prince Henry once said, "Only my father would cage such a bird." I just think that this guy was just all over the place, and he was just,
I mean, think about the benefit of that medicine. It may have been so nasty as to distract you from whatever was ailing you. But you know what, Chris, you're talking about, his time in the Tower of London. He was in the Tower of London here for 13 years. And because of his wealth and because of his status, he had access, like you said, to a library, to other things. But he had guards with him. He had, or excuse me, not guards, servants. He had visits by his wife. He and his wife Bess conceived a child while he was in the Tower of London. So, I mean, when we think about his time in the Tower of London, we don't need to think of him being chained to a wall or anything. He's sort of on house arrest, but Chris, he's living a better life even in the Tower of London than a lot of the peasants who were free out on the street.
Yes, and in James the First, for whatever reason, I don't know, but as you mentioned, he says, "Okay, I'm gonna let this joker out," and what Raleigh promises that he's going to behave, he's going to be a good boy, everything's going to be fine, and for some strange reason, which just goes to show you that kings and queens don't always use the best brain power that they have, but he decides to send Raleigh on another expedition, and that expedition goes about as well as everything else Raleigh has been a part of. It doesn't go well at all, and actually it turns out to be a big, massive fiasco.
Yeah, like you said earlier, I believe you had mentioned that King James I was really trying to solve some of the issues between Spain and England. And when Walter Raleigh is sent by James I, he is sent to search for gold in South America. So he's sent across the Atlantic to visit South America. While he's there, he attacks some Spanish territory. And I mean, it's just like you said, it is just a spectacular debacle. Raleigh is recalled to England. He's arrested. And of course, he is charged with those crimes. But ultimately, the violation of the peace treaty is not what gets him in trouble. Instead, he is charged with treason against King James I.
Yeah, and that leads to there being this huge trial that everybody's going to come to, and really say, okay, what are we going to do? I mean, at the end of the day, I think finally he's just come to the end of his rope. No pun intended, I guess. But he's come to the end where the Attorney General, when they're holding this trial, the Attorney General's name was Sir Edward Coke, and he said this, quote, "Thou art a monster. Thou hast an English face, but a Spanish heart." And Raleigh is, even though he's able to defend himself, and even though he seems to win the crowd, he cannot win the support of the king. And so eventually the Spanish do demand Raleigh's head. Raleigh returns to England, and basically they're going to get it because What was it? 1618? Is that when he climbs the scaffold?
Yeah, he does. He climbs the scaffold in 1618. But we need to remember real quick here, and I don't think I wanted to make this point clear because I don't think I did earlier. When he is brought back and he's tried for what happened in South America, those charges are just sort of set aside, and it's taken back to the main plot. The treason there. That's ultimately what he is executed for. And Chris, it's June of 1618. A 66-year-old Sir Walter Raleigh is taken to the scaffolding to be beheaded. And I think when I was doing research for this episode, Chris, John Chamberlain, who was a newspaper writer at the time, witnessed the scene and wrote an eyewitness report of Raleigh's final moments. And I want to take a minute to sort of review some of the things he says. Raleigh, of course, is taken to the place of his execution. He gives this speech, which actually turns into more of a sermon almost. I think they said it was like 20 or 25 minutes of a speech. He climbs the scaffolding, and the executioner, as was common, would ask the person to be executed for forgiveness for what they were about to do. And Walter Raleigh, when the axeman asked him for forgiveness, he asked to see the axe, which the axeman had under his coat. And he pulls the axe out, and Walter Raleigh, Chris, he runs his thumb across the edge of that axe. And he says, when he does that, he says it was a fair, sharp medicine to cure him of all his diseases and miseries. So after that, his clothing is cut to expose his neck. And there's and he lays down to have his head chopped off, and there's some complaining about his positioning. So he turns around, and the executioner sort of, he says, I'll give you a signal. That's what he tells the executioner. And he gives the signal, and the executioner, Chris, sort of hesitates. And Raleigh says, strike, man, strike. And I'm sure he probably regretted that because, Chris, as often happened, the execution didn't go too terribly smoothly, as it took 2 blows to remove poor Walter Raleigh's head. And they said, he didn't move after the first blow, so maybe the first blow killed him or rendered him unconscious, but that could not be a pleasant way to die.
No, and it's pretty good, fitting way to end, I guess, his life, because everything that he tried, he always had to try again. It just never seemed to work too well. And, you have to feel sorry for Raleigh. You have to feel sorry for him because he allowed the trappings of gold and power corrupt his mind. When I think in his heart, if you take away his hatred for Catholics and things of that nature, I think in his heart, he just wanted to do what he thought was best for his country, that he just wanted to serve his country, but that he fell into the trappings of everything that comes with that. He was able to woo the queen with verse, but he was unable to save his head from the axe because of his verse. And isn't that often the case? Sometimes we talk too much and we say nothing instead of just saying one thing and saying it all. And who knows, there's probably many listeners who would say, well, Chris should take that in advice. There's a lot of times he said too much when he should have just said one. I can't land the plane, Ray.
It does happen. And, Chris, just we'll close out here. I think Walter Raleigh's head, and this is one of those things that just I don't understand. But his head, his body is cremated. His head is embalmed. And they give it back to his wife. So she spends the next 29 years of her life until her death with her deceased husband's head in a bag. And the bag apparently is still in existence today. And I'm just trying to figure out what she did with this bag with a head in it. I mean, what does one do with it? Does one take it to town and take it shopping? I mean, it's just a very strange thing. But she, of course, dies 29 years later. And at her death, of course, his head is finally buried as well. So, Chris, hopefully this episode has been interesting to our listeners. I know it was to us. We're going to land the plane right now. I hope our listeners have enjoyed this episode. If you have any comments or questions or suggestions, you can contact us at historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know @gmail.com. You can find us on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Sounder FM, and Facebook. We do have a great new Facebook page that's up and running and doing well. And we hope you will check us out there, give us a like, and give us a shout and let us know that you are listening. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And we'll talk to you later.